hope you're doing well. I went on a little walk today while in quarantine in my backyard. We live in the woods, so I thought this would be a fun place to stop and read some of our book that we've been reading together. So the last questions that we read were in Chapter 5, Part A. We just read a little bit of Chapter 5, and those questions were, did Serafina make it out of the electrical room? Well, yes, she did. If you look on page 63, I think that's what page Chapter 5 starts on. Yes, 63. It says that Serafina clung to the metal racks on the ceiling, hidden among the hundreds of thick copper wires that ran across the floors above. Then if you drop down just a little bit to paragraph 2, it says that Serafina crawled along the ceiling, dropped silently to the floor behind them, and darted out the open door. So she got away safely, away from Mr. Bozeman and the two people that were with him. And I think all those years that she's been catching rats in the Biltmore house has really helped her pay off to get away without being heard or seen. Then the second question was, what did Serafina find in the sub-basement? Well, if you flip, it was towards the very end where we read, not the very, very end, but towards the end. And it says that she saw something lying at the base of the wall that at the first glance looked like a dead, rotting rat. But the more that she looked at it and the more that she examined it, she realized that it was a glove lying crumbled on the floor, and images of the black cloak swirling around her rose in her mind. So that she thinks that was the black cloaks, but also when we continue reading, she wants to find evidence to bring to Braden Vanderbilt, but she realizes that that glove is just common, so she might need to find something a little more worthwhile for Braden to really believe her. But that's where we kind of left off at, so we're going to go ahead and we're going to continue reading. The last thing that we read was that she had wished that she had given more of a better impression, because she says, as it was, she wasn't sure what sort of impression that she had made, except that she was dirty, rude, unkempt, and had bad hair. So let's go ahead and read on to Chapter 5, the rest of it, and let's see what happens throughout this story. All right, we're picking up for the second part of Chapter 5. She darted up the stairs to the first floor. She took advantage of the chaos of the search to scurry unseen from one hiding spot to another. She moved silently, padding swiftly on soft feet. The adults spoke so loudly and made such a glomping noise when they stomped all over the place that they were easy to avoid. She dashed over to the winter gardens where she hid beneath the fronds of the tropical plants. As Miss Vanderbilt, who's seen two servants, hurried down the corridor, Serafina scooted into the billiard room and made a narrow escape. She thought that even her rodent enemies would have been impressed by her quickness of foot on that particular maneuver. Walled in rich oak paneling and appointed with soft leather chairs, the billiard room smelled of cigar smoke. Deep-hued oriental carpets covered the floors. Black wrought iron lamps fixtures hung down from the ceiling over the game tables. Animal heads and hunting trophies lined the walls. She liked those. The trophies on the walls reminded her of the rats she killed and laid at her pa's feet. So she and the Vanderbilts had that much in common. On the other hand, she had stopped doing that when she realized that it was the catching she liked more than the killing. Just as she was about to leave the room, the footman came in with one of the maids. Serafina quickly dove beneath the billiard table. Just as she was about to leave the room, maybe she had been giving us a slip at every turn, Miss Whitney, the footman said, leaning down to look under the billiard table just as Serafina darted behind the sofa. She could be just about anywhere, Mr. Pratt, said Miss Whitney, agreed, looking behind the sofa just as Serafina hid in the green velvet curtains that adorned the windows. Do you know if anyone's checked the pipe organs? Mr. Pratt asked. There's a secret room back there. The girl's a pianist, so she might be curious about the organ, Miss Whitney agreed. Taking a quick breath and using the curtain for cover, Serafina climbed up the window-style lickety-split, then wedged herself into the uppermost corner of the window. She had just enough time to see that Mr. Pratt was wearing white gloves, a black tie, and a black and white footman's livery. She just took a special notice at his black patent leather dress shoes. "What do you mean she's a pianist?" Mr. Pratt asked. "Tilly, on the 3rd floor, told me that the girl's some sort of musical prodigy. Gives piano concerts all over the country." Miss Whitney said, just as her ran her hands through the curtains where Serafina had just been hiding. Serafina held her breath and stayed very still. Miss Whitney was so close to her now that she could smell her sweet lavender and rose perfume. All Miss Whitney had to do was pull back on the curtain and look up and see Serafina clinging there with a Cheshire smile. Despite her fear of being seen, Serafina couldn't resist noticing the details of the maid's outfit. She loved the pretty pink uniform with its white collar and cuffs, which the maids wore in the morning before changing into their more formal black and white uniforms in the afternoon. "Come on, there's no one in here," Mr. Pratt said. "We'll check the pipe organ." Serafina breathed a sigh of relief as Miss Whitney walked to the other side of the room. Mr. Pratt pushed the oak panel wall just to the right of the fireplace. "Oh my," Miss Whitney said in surprise, laughing nervously as a concealed door opened up. "I've cleaned this room countless times, and I've never seen that was there. You're always so clever, Mr. Pratt." Serafina rolled her eyes at Miss Whitney's silliness. The maid was obviously besotted with this know-it-all footman. Serafina liked Miss Whitney, but she could sure use some help in learning how to sniff out a rat. And that was exactly what Serafina thought about shiny shoes, Mr. Pratt. Mr. Pratt laughed, clearly pleased with Miss Whitney's reaction to his little trick. "How do you know all of these secret things?" Miss Whitney asked him. "Do you sulk through the rooms at night when everyone else is asleep?" "Oh, I'm full of surprises, Miss Whitney, and not just about a girl in a yellow dress. You wait and see," he said. "Come on." Yellow dress? How did he know what Clara was wearing when she disappeared? There was something about this footman that Serafina didn't like. He was too slick, too flirty, too tricky in his hoity-toity black livery, and didn't trust him any more than she trusted a rat in the pastry kitchen. "I wouldn't go in there if I were you," she wanted to shout to Miss Whitney as they passed through the concealed door, but instead she listened to the rat's footsteps. They were similar to the footsteps that she had heard in the basement the night before. Sorry, there was a bird. But he and Miss Whitney disappeared into the wall too quickly for her to be sure one way or the other. As soon as they were gone, she climbed down and checked the area to the right of the fireplace to make sure that she had been able to find the concealed door if she ever needed it. A concealed door could be a very useful thing to a girl of her particular occupation. Measuring 3 oak panels tall and 2 oak panels wide, the door was disguised to look exactly like the wall. There was even a framed picture hanging there, a weirdly realistic tintype of a white-haired old man that she guessed was probably Mr. Vanderbilt's long-dead grandfather, Cornelius Vanderbilt. It pained her to think that not only did she have a grandpa to tell her stories about the old times, she barely even had a pa anymore. He was just someone who found her in a bloody heap and decided to steal goat's milk to keep her alive in his toolbox. He could be anybody, and she was still mightily perturbed at him for not coming straight with her sooner. Below the hunting trophies that loomed above, the wall was covered with portraits of Vanderbilts: mother, father, grandmother, grandfather, brothers, sisters, and cousins. She found herself instinctively searching the faces to see if any of them resembled her. Was Clara Brams alive someplace, wondering if her mother had forgotten her, just as Serafina often wondered about her own? But the difference was that Mrs. Brams hadn't forgotten her daughter, would never leave her behind. Clara Brams' mother was still looking for her. Serafina stepped closer to the wall of pictures. The last picture was another depiction of old Cornelius, the patriarch of the Grand Vanderbilt family, walking proudly beside one of his iron steam trains, the blur of his motion giving him a ghost-like quality. It put shivers down her spine just looking at it. But the picture had gone a bit catawampus when Mr. Pratt and Miss Whitney went through, so she straightened it out. When she touched the door, it glided open on smooth, well-oiled hinges. She took a deep breath, then slipped through. To her surprise, the secret door led to the smoking room. From there, she found a similar passage into the gun room, with its racks of rifles and shotguns protected by panes of glass. Seeing her reflection in the glass, she spit on the back of her hand and wiped her face until she got a few of the larger smudges off her cheeks and chin. Then she smoothed her long brown streaked hair back behind her ears in a quick few movements. She stood there and just stared at herself, wondering if her mama saw her, would she recognize her? Would she hug her and kiss her, or would she look the other way, just keep walking? When strangers saw her, what did they think? What did they see? A girl or a creature? As a group of estate guests walked past the room, she heard them talking in hushed voices that perked up her ears. "I'm telling you, it's true," a young man whispered. "I heard about it too," whispered another. "My grandma told me that there's an old cemetery out there with hundreds of gravestones, but the bodies are missing." "I heard there's an old village," said a third voice. "It's all overgrown and taken back by the forest, like everyone who lived there abandoned their houses." Serafina had heard the tall tales pass around among the kitchen folk at night, but she had never been too sure whether she was supposed to believe them or not. Every place she went in the house that day, she had overheard conversation, gentlemen discussing whether detectives should be called to investigate the missing child, servants trading stories of suspicious guests, parents arguing about the best way to protect their sons and daughters from getting lost in the giant house without being rude to the Vanderbilts. And now they were talking about the old cemetery in the woods. She kept thinking about the man in the black cloak. If he was one of these people, could he be lurking in any corridor or room? How could you tell a friend from an enemy just by looking at him? It seemed like the farther she went, the more questions she had. The only thing certain so far was that the search continued and they still hadn't found Clara Brams, either alive or dead. Then she had an idea. If the man in the black cloak was some sort of raft that had drifted out of the forest at night, or if he conjured himself out of the ether of the basement, then she probably couldn't find very much evidence of him in the upper floors of the house. But if the man in the black cloak was at least partially mortal and resided at Biltmore, then he'd have to stash his cloak someplace when he wasn't wearing it. If she could find the cloak, then maybe she could find the man. The closets and storerooms throughout the house were some of her favorite hiding spots, so she knew them well. When ladies and gentlemen came to Biltmore, they usually exited from their carriages at the front door, but in bad weather, they used the covered porte cochere at the north end of the house, near the stables. Always out of sight, darting and dodging, creeping and crawling, she made her way there. The coat room was dark and cramped, which suited her just fine. She loved closets. She pushed her way through the thick forest of coats, cloaks, stoles, and capes. She searched the hangers one by one, looking for a long black satin cloak. When she reached the back wall of the coat room without finding it, she couldn't help but feeling a pang of disappointment. She crept out of the coat room. She realized that she'd have to go to Braden without any proof, but the truth that she hadn't been able to find him either. "You've got to think, girl," she heard her pa telling her in the tone he used when she couldn't reckon one of her lessons. "Use what you know and think it through." An idea came to her. Knowing what she did about Braden Vanderbilt, he'd either be with his dog or with his horse, or both. He loved horses. It would be the first thing he thought of. He would go to the stables to help the stableman look for Clara Brand there. Or maybe he'd search the ground on horseback. Either way, the stable seemed like the place to go. The most direct path was through the porte cochere. There were quite a few people coming and going through this busy area, but she'd hoped that if anyone spotted her, they'd assume that she was a scullery maid or a kindling girl going about her chores. She took a deep breath and ran down the steps towards the archway that led to the stables. She moved fast. She thought she was going to make it, but just as she looked behind her to make sure no one was following her, she coiled with a great smash into a large man in front of her. It knocked the wind out of her and nearly knocked her off her feet, but the man grabbed her by the shoulders and held her up with a brutal grip. Her captor wore a full-length black rain cloak, even though it wasn't raining. He had a particular pointed beard, crooked teeth, and an ugly, pock-marked face. She hadn't even seen the face of the man with the black cloak, but this is what she imagined he had looked like. "What are you looking at?" he demanded. "Who is you anyway?" "I ain't nobody," she spat defiantly, trying desperately to tear herself free and run, but the man's hands clamped her so tight that she couldn't escape. Now it was her turn to be the biting rat, with its neck squeezing between finger and thumb. She noticed that he was standing in front of the open door of the awaiting carriage. "You the new pig girl?" he demanded. "What you doing up here?" He tightened his grip so viciously on her arm that she let out a squeal in pain. "I said, what's your name, you little scamp?" "None of your business," she said as she kicked and fought any way she could. The man had a terrible smell, like he needed a bath really, really bad, and his breath stank with a huge wad of purified chewing tobacco that bulged in his cheek. "Tell me your name or I'm gonna shake you," the man said, even as he shook her. He shook her so violently that she couldn't catch her breath or get her feet on the ground. He just kept shaking her. "Mr. Crankshould," a firm, authoritative voice from behind her. It wasn't just a name, it was a command. Startled, the ugly man stopped shaking her and set her on her feet and began to smooth her hair, pretending that he had actually been taking care of her all along. Gasping for breath, she turned to look who had spoken. There stood Braden Vanderbilt at the top of the steps. And that is the end of chapter 5.